Every day another door closes, but a new one opens again. Whoa, every way we travel must end, but there another road begins. Whatever you've seen, haven't you heard?
Thank you so much for braving the weather and coming out today. I can never say enough about drawing from the figure. It's just such an amazing process. And every time we do it, it's a new experience. And with each model, you're seeing different things. And so I really wanted to get to this exercise because, to me, this is the way that we have to approach drawing the figure. I mean, if you want to get things right, you have to be able to know how to simplify the details. And so that's lying down, moving, or sitting. You know, basically, you don't get very much information. But then as you move closer, you go half the distance, you see twice as much detail. And so as you get closer to the figure, you don't see the details like fingers and eyelashes and things like that until right at the end. So what you're experiencing is this process of starting with the simplified figure and moving toward the details. So this is an exercise I call Tim Holmes' approach to the figure. And it's an exercise where you do with your body what I try to get you to do with your mind when you're looking at a pose for the first time of a human figure. So here, clear at the other end of the building, you can see a figure. And you hardly can tell any information about it, like you're looking at him from across the beach. All you can tell is the shape, the overall shape, and the orientation to the earth. So let's take half the distance. So we're going to close in on the figure. To about half the distance where we were before. And now, of course, the figure is twice as big. But it's still very, very small. So it's like you've moved up half the distance of the beach. And you can still see him, you can still see the position, but you can't really tell anything more than the general shape. You can't see any greater detail than that. So let's half the distance again. And of course, the figure's twice as big. And now, finally, you can begin to map out where those three major elements are: the head, the thorax, and the pelvis, how they're oriented with each other. But more than that, you can't really tell. So we'll take half the distance again. And finally, you can begin to see how the major muscle masses are figured and where the limbs are. But that's about the extent of what you can figure out from this distance. So we take the distance again in half, and now you're close enough. You're about the same distance as you would be if this was the model posing for you. So finally you can begin to see the details like the fingers or the facial features and even the texture of the body and so forth. So that's what I call the approach to the figure, and this is what I want people to do every time they see a pose that they're going to draw. Right? So hopefully what you experienced was something like this. The first thing you see is just kind of a shape. And you can tell that the figure is moving because it's not straight up and down. So there's really no delineation. You can't tell the sex, you can't tell anything except the position, the orientation to the earth. You take half the distance and then you start to see the overall shape of the figure. All right? And so think about it when you're doing a drawing. If you start with that process, that you do just the roughest shape, and then you refine the shape a little bit, then you move half the distance again, and you start to see the basic form of the human being, which is those three immovable elements: the head, the thorax, and the hips. And it's really important to get those three elements in proper relationship to each other, because everything else depends on those three. And that's what we're going to spend our time on tonight. Anyway, when you can put that into your drawing, you move half again toward the model, and you can start to see the large muscle groups, like the shoulders, the thigh, and you can tell what the orientation of the limbs are. But you can't see any more detail than that. You move again half the distance, and then you can start to see the smaller muscle groups. You can start to see the hand, how the fingers are displayed. You can start to get to greater details. And finally, at the end of that process, you can finally see things like eyelashes and fingers, things like that. What we're trying to do is to simplify the enormous complexity of the human being. Human beings are so fascinating. And the more you look at people, the more you draw, the more fascinating they become. And it seems to me, unless you're just doing like head portraits, if you're doing the whole figure, you really have to simplify it because the complexities are so incredibly complex. So what we're trying to do is, first of all, see the structure of the body. And even this is way too complex to start with. So what our friend Bridgman does is he reduces the body to this kind of a arrangement, what I call just a glorified stick figure. And as you can see, it consists of these three components and the spine that ties everything together. And all the rest of it, the limbs, that's frosting. So don't even think about that for the time being. I want to emphasize that this is really, really helpful because if you're looking at a pose, for instance, and you can't really tell how things go together, you can come grab this and put it into the pose that you're seeing and look at the relationships between these elements, and that'll help you to see into the body. Because essentially what we're trying to do is use your X-ray vision to figure out where the bones are. And that's a very hard process because there's a lot of flesh on our bodies and everybody is different. And so trying to determine where the structure is, you're really using a lot of not only your X-ray vision, but your kind of intuition, delving into your own experience of what it is to be alive. And you can feel in your own body what you see in somebody else's, unless they're a real contortionist, and then we have problems. But for the most part, if you see somebody in a certain pose, you can feel it in your body. And for me, it really helps to make the association, to get myself inside their body so I can feel what that pose is about. And this helps us to be able to formulate the idea. Because the fact is, we've been in these bodies for a long time, some of us quite a bit longer than the rest of you. But we have this really, really rich experience. And you have an intuitive sense for how the body comes together and how it relates to the earth that is so far deep in the unconscious that in order to drag it up into consciousness, you really kind of have to work at it. So that's what we're trying to do with this exercise and with this lesson tonight. is trying to figure out how to make sense of this simplified form. To that end, I brought in a ship.
Oh, excellent.
Wow, it's quite a transition.
Is that a little too fast?
Sword last week's ship has got a pirate theme.
Now, this is, of course, a historic ship. I think probably they just print these things out on a big 3D printer now. I don't know how to do them now, but in the old days, in the good old days, when you built a wooden ship, you had to start with the keel, and everything else is embedded in the keel. So you have your timbers, and you build this this incredibly strong support system that is going to support the entire outfit. And it's into the keel that everything else fits. The ribs fit into that, and the masts are stepped down into the keel. But that's not what you experience when you see this in the harbor. You know, the first thing we tend to do when we see something like this is, you know, you see something like the spars on the front, whatever's closest to your eye. And you think, wow, that's so beautiful, I'm going to start with that spar. And the trouble with that is when you start putting the rest of the ship underneath it, you have to kind of guess where everything goes. And so, you know, you try to connect the spar to the mast, and you try to connect the mast to the ship, and nothing really looks right. And what I'm suggesting is you always have to do it the reverse. You always have to start with the keel, figure out how the mast is set into the keel, or the ribs that hold the deck, and then you can place your spar on the mast. It's really similar to the way the human body is constructed. Now, for one thing, like all the vertebrates, we were fortunately designed with bilateral symmetry, right? So everything is divided in half all the way down the middle. And that's really great for us artists because you only have to memorize half the body. And you just repeat it on the other side and you got the whole thing done.
Wow.
It's great.
It's easier than I thought.
And I think all the vertebrates are like that except maybe the narwhal. It's the only thing I can think of that has this one tooth that sticks out front. So as a vertebrate, everything is very symmetrically designed. So it's really easy to place the figure in this kind of a grid pattern because there's an equal amount of architecture on each side of the lateral line, just like a ship. And the difference between us and the ship is always like this, you know, except for the spars that kind of move back and forth like this. The whole thing is solid. And imagine how hard it would be to draw one of these things if all the parts moved, you know. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to imagine how you have this very symmetrical architecture, how you can keep a pattern of that in your brain and then apply it to a real live person. The fact is, of course, we never stand like this unless you're in the military, right? If you're standing in line at the post office, everybody standing in line is going to be like this, or like this, or like this. There's always asymmetry. And the first thing we have to learn about simplifying the figure is that even though you know that we're all built like this, you have to figure out where the keel of the system is. And that's why this is so helpful. Here's the guy in the military. You know, he's extremely stiff and very symmetrical. Everybody we run into in this side of the veil is going to be something like this. You know, a little bit cattywampus, a little bit askew. And the key to making a lifelike drawing is to figure out how these elements relate to each other. I want you to get in the habit of drawing that glorified stick figure. And we won't worry about the proportions, I'll get to that next time. But what that consists of is these three basically square elements that are pinned together with the spine. So that architecture right there is the keel of the ship. And the parts that are attached to it, you know, this is like the thorax is one of the masts. And there she is, come on in. And of course, it's rooted in the keel. It's symmetrical. And now what we have to figure out is how it's going to relate to those other two elements. So can I get you to close the door just to keep you?
So can I ask you, just
Yeah.
to put in my own head, what you're saying in relation to the keel and the blocks, or as humans, do you see you see the keel as the three blocks, or you see it as the spine?
The spine.
The spine, okay.
Yeah.
All
The
right.
spine is going to hold everything together.
Okay.
But unlike the ship, it's flexible.
Yeah.
What I want to get across is the flexibility is going to be between those three elements. So when you see a radical movement, most of the movement is going to be in between those elements. So what I just did is this. And the solid blocks are still in the same place. It's the movement is in between.
Mm-hmm.
So the stick figure is made out of these blocks. And the reason why this is so helpful is, you know, a block is each one of these components is a square piece. The reason why it's square is because when there's a change in orientation, all of the parts move the same way. So, and this is part of trying to figure out how the simplification works. So when you move your torso, the whole thing moves, you know, the orientation of this corner moves, and all four corners are going to move with the same tilt, right? It's really hard to see if the rest of the figure isn't moving. So if it's just the thorax that's moving, it doesn't feel like there's very much change in the structure. And maybe the outline is going to look the same. So your tendency is to sort of look at the outline and say, oh, okay, I think I have it. You put the outline in, and all of a sudden your structure is gone. If you look at Michelangelo, all of his figures are firmly structured. And you know, he has these really dramatically shaped bodies that he draws. And you can always tell where everything is. Egon Schiele is another artist, an artist from Vienna in the turn of the 20th century, who drew without any internal structure. And you know, it's fabulous drawing. It's really expressive, but you get the feeling looking at his figures that these are corpses. And you know, they're really kind of creepy. And that's what he's after, so that's why he's so good at it. But the reason why they look dead is because you intuitively look at this body and you think, oh my God, all those bones are broken. Because nothing matches up. And what we're trying to do is to give you the tools to be able to draw like Michelangelo, even if expressively what you want to do is Egon Schiele. So that when you break those bones, you know what you're doing. Because the structure is so important. If you definitely want to throw it out the window, you at least have the tools, or you know what rules you're breaking. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want to, I did it again. So what I want us to be able to do is to find the figure in whatever orientation it is, and make this square shape that gives you the structure to work with. And that's why it's important to know, to have these corners, so you know for each immovable unit how that is oriented according to your eye, right? So, you know, the thorax facing this way is different than the thorax facing this way. So the way to make that determination in your head is by following the box form. And once you get really good at this, you can take a lot of shortcuts. So, and I'll talk about that later. You know, I end up doing something that's a little bit like that. And it serves the same purpose as long as I know in my head that this orientation is the same as this orientation. So I'm just turning a square shape into a little bit more rounded shape. So we'll get to that later, but let me, I want to emphasize how important it is to get the relationship between those three units. Because when you see the pose, there's going to be a little bit of variation. It's not going to be like this. It's going to be, something is going to be out of whack, out of plumb. And so you want to be able to figure out conceptually what is out of plumb and in which direction. I'm looking at it, I can't figure out where it is. Get up and walk around so that you can see, oh yes, there's a difference between the orientation of the hips and the chest cavity, right? And those subtle movements are what make the figure come alive. It really pops if what you get is a structure that is in which all those three relationships are together. So you look at this and you can kind of feel, okay, I could believe that that's a living thing, even though all you're looking at is just some scribbles. And then once that happens, once you get those pieces pinned down, then you can add arms and legs, because the shoulders are going to be pinned to that thorax. No matter how it moves, the shoulders are always going to be pinned in the same place. So as you move the arm, it looks like there's a lot of changes, but the shoulder joint, the root of the mast, is always in the same place. And the same with the hip bones. So that's why I put so much emphasis on those three immovable components. Okay? So, I want to give you a homework assignment. And that's going to entail your taking home a bunch of catalogs that I'll give you. I want you to find some figures and find those three components. So I just happen to be able to be using this because it's big enough for you that you can see it. You don't need the tracing paper, but take a marker a thick black marker if you can get it. And right on the figure, I want you to draw 3 squares.
Do you mean cubes or do you mean squares?
Boxes. I want you to take your catalog and just draw cubes in whatever shape the figure is. So you have those 3 elements and pin them together with the spine. I tried to find catalogs where people weren't dressed so warmly, but it's really hard in Montana.
You're looking at Land's End catalogs?
But what I want you to do is to take your marker and just right on top of this thing, pin the skeleton together using those 3 elements. But what I want you to see is the relationship between those 3 elements. When we see most of the people around us, unfortunately, they all have clothes on. It makes it really hard to see what's going on, right? So you're looking at this kind of a form, trying to figure out where the structure is, and you can hardly even see anything. But it gets a lot easier if the person doesn't have clothes on. All of a sudden you can see where everything is, right? So I am going to force you to use these 3 elements. If you don't want to do it, take somebody else's class. Because it's really the only way to figure out how to simplify this really incredibly complex structure.